So, okay, I think that's a very good segue into the teaching Purescript functional programming, not specifically Purescript aspect, right? So are you interested in teaching functional programming generally, or are you just mostly interested in some parts like type inference or other things, or do you like?
I don't. I'm gonna say that I have. I'm not sure if I've taught functional programming to a lot of people. I've the things I'm teaching are more about compiler stuff. Really, I've taught my students how to write Alexa, how to write a parser, and how to write a type checker, and how to write an interpreter, and that kind of stuff. And I usually do it in a functional style because that's just how I write programs. And it's also just the easiest way to write these programs because they're naturally dealing with trees. And so if you just do recursion, that's the easiest way of working with these things.
So is this course at the university specifically about compilers?
Yes, it's called Programming Languages and Compilers.
Okay.
But I do show them the Lambda Calculus, and we do. The first thing we did was deal with abstract syntax. So think enough programs as trees, and then we drew a bunch of trees and reduced by reducing trees and rewriting trees from one format to the other. And then we wrote an interpreter that did the same. So rewrote a bunch of trees. And then we did, because that turned out to be really tricky, because capture is really hard when you're rewriting trees. I end up showing them what a closure is essentially and how to implement one. And from there, we get into the less theoretical and more practical way of thinking about programs as programs essentially.
And you said that this course you're using Kotlin here because they're already familiar with it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and Kotlin is actually, as a language, as long as I don't need to do anything fancy, really, it's a very nice language to program in. Because, well, JetBrains IDEs are just fantastic. And so you get like really easy case splitting kind of stuff. It's got completions for everything.
And people are used to them, right? Most importantly.
Yeah. And I mean, I find Kotlin to be a fun little language. If I need to write an Android app, I'll most certainly write it in Kotlin because I think it feels like a modern Java.
Okay.
Nice one.
Interesting. Cool. So how do you like it? Like, how do you like doing this teaching part? Do you how did you get into it actually? Like, did you want to do it? Did the university contact you? Did you?
It's actually two friends of mine who both work at the university. Were like they knew that I was doing kind of fancy things, and that I did programming.
And you actually work on compilers, right?
Yeah, I do actually. I work on compilers for a living, exactly. And so they're both of them are basically mobile developers. So what they do iOS development and Android development most of the time. And so they asked me if I didn't want to teach them some stuff. They were just curious. So we set out and we met once a week over a year or so. And in that time, I basically taught them how to build a compiler, which then ended up becoming the course. So we condensed that down and made that into the course. I think we were kind of looking for the best way of me teaching them something, and so we said, I told them to watch the recording of that talk, the 45-minute recording of that talk, and they were both lost after 5 minutes and had no clue. And so I said, all right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to make you, I'm going to give you the ability to watch that talk from start to end and understand everything that's going on. And that's basically what we did.
Cool.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been into teaching for a while now because, I mean, on Slack, I'm usually around on Slack, and I really I enjoy answering people's questions and working with them and like helping them understand really. And I don't know, it just gives me satisfaction. I like teaching. Part of that is that I usually only really understand stuff or like things by the time I've figured out how to teach it to someone else.
Yep. I totally relate to that. Yeah.
And so that's kind of
Yeah.
my way of actually learning something, is teaching it to someone, or
Yeah.
figuring out the best way of teaching something to someone.
And then sometimes you see a question, you're like, oh, I know this thing. And then when you try to type out the answer, you realize that you don't know it as well as you thought you did, right? Does that happen to you? Yeah, right? So you're like, oh, wait, I need to read a bit more before answering, because actually I have some intuitive idea of it, but I don't know it well enough to type out an answer, right?
Right. And the thing that I really need when I'm teaching something to someone is I need this like red line, which this is where we start. This is the thing we want to achieve. And now I'm going to motivate every step we do based on the thing we did before. And we're going to reach the, like, there's not going to be a jump or a hole in here somewhere. And that's usually the hardest part for me. Like, I have all the bits and pieces, but to get them into a linear, because you can only teach in a linear fashion, right? There's only one thing at a time you can teach to someone. As soon as you make them learn two things at once, they're usually kind of screwed.
Yep.
And
I
like
totally agree.
ordering things in that linear fashion is really the tricky bit, I think.
Yep, I totally agree. So I was wondering, wait, because I'm trying to find it, but like it seems like where is it? Palu isn't able to find it either. Do you have a link for your paper somewhere, like the thesis about type inference?
Sure, it's a Dropbox link, so it's kind of hard to find.
You can like if you're not on Twitch, you can paste it in Discord, and I can grab it from Discord. Oh, and I need to.
Sure. I mean, I can also just paste it into Twitch. I just need to make sure
I wasn't sure you were
myself out of existence. I haven't opened the chat the stream right now, but I'm following you, so it's not hard to find it.
Cool. So yeah. Meanwhile, let me find the. Oh, there we go. We have it in chat.
There we go.
Cool.
Yes,
Thank you.
exactly. That's the link. Yes.
I actually have it saved somewhere on my computer, but I can't share that link, right? Because it's not a link; it's on my computer.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's I wrote that when I was learning about these things, so not all of it is as coherent or correct as it is as I write it now. But at the same time, it's written from the perspective of someone learning it, and it's not just me writing it as I was learning it. It's me writing it as I was learning it, and Phil fact checking it so that I didn't end up writing a bunch of crap in my bachelor's thesis.
It did seem pretty accurate in my opinion, because like for example the way I learned, because when I learned Purescript and Haskell, I was like it was a couple of years ago, and I didn't have a very good formal mathematical background, but my wife is a PhD math teacher at the local university, right? So I kind of leaned on math a lot when learning FP, because I had her, and I was like also very interested in the like math part of it, right? So my journey was a lot more like I leaned a lot into math while learning, basically, right? And I actually used your thesis to like quite early. I was just reading it and understanding things, and like, oh, okay, I kind of see how this thing relate and so on, right? It was actually it was very good, right? Because if you find a like academic paper, like a recent one, it's going to be very, very complicated, right? Whereas in your thesis, you try to explain these things kind of, well, relatively simply, right? Like okay, this is how this works, and I'm going to use this sort of algorithm here and so on, right? So it's a very good resource for this sort of thing, right? Because usually papers kind of skim on on doing a basic good introduction to the subject, right? You're kind of like, okay, this is trivial, everybody knows this, let's get into the like crazy category tier or whatever thing that we want to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, a part of that is that the professor that was writing my thesis, it's not at all into, like, he's not into type theory or compilers or anything, right? He's actually much more into learning, so like technology for learning. So he's worked on smart boards and all kinds of interactive programming, kind of like visual programming stuff and all that. So he wasn't like, he had no clue about any of the stuff I was writing about. So I felt like the thesis also kind of needed to because, well, when I write for my readers. I don't write to show what I know. And so I kind of have to pick people up where they're at and to bring them to me so that I can show them something interesting and new.
Cool.
I feel like that kind of writing was what made the specialist users. And I've heard like from multiple people now that they've found that it helped them learn and that they enjoyed reading it. So
Okay.
that's nice.
Yep. Yeah, it's actually, I recommend people read it because it's actually very interesting, especially if you're not already very familiar with this concept, right? If you're very comfortable writing your own type checker, then maybe you don't get too much out of it. But if you haven't done that, then it's also interesting to see like the theory is laid down pretty well there, and not too it's not too hard to digest.
Nice.
Cool. So let's see. Right. So one other thing that I mentioned in the beginning is like I've seen that you're a big Emacs person, right? So what's your relationship with that? Like, is it a love-hate relationship where you kind of hate Elise,
It
but you're
absolutely is, yes. So I mean, there's lots of things to hate about Emacs, but it's also really the only editor I feel at home in. So I've been using a lot of VS Code recently, more recently because, well, for Motoko, I'm building the ID integration, and so I'm going to make sure that I'm using LSP, but I'm going to make sure it works in VS Code first because that's the editor with the highest usage percentages these days, right? And so I kind of again need to go where my customers are there. But for my own stuff, it's Emacs, but I use Emacs. So the point where I really got into Emacs was actually Spacemacs when I discovered Spacemacs, which is this kind of
oh yeah,
amalgam of Vim key bindings
and
with magic.
bloaty, crazy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I really got into Vim bindings then. But whenever I try to actually use Vim, I find that all the things that I like about Emacs are missing. It has the nice key bindings, which I'm used to but I mean, I have those in Emacs now as well. So I've never been a real Vim user, but I'm using Vim key bindings everywhere now.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say things that are missing, are there things like Magit and like all of the cool and the useful plugins that you use, or is it something more? Like, is it visual? Is it?
I mean, that's for sure. So that's definitely, so Magit is the only Git client I'm ever going to use. So Magit is fantastic. No, it's also just I'm used to this kind of buffer management that you do in Emacs, where in Vim you kind of just restart on the file you want to edit, and then you close it down and open it up again, which is I'm kind of I don't like to leave my editor for stuff. I like the Emacs pull everything in and make everything a plugin. There's also just the fuzzy finders that are really nice. So the IVs and Helms. I don't know if you're into if you've ever used Emacs much, but there's lots of plugins for searching and filtering down things, which work very well. In general, there's just a few things I like to customize. So I don't customize a lot in Emacs, but the few things I customize, I end up really liking.
Okay, interesting.
That I can make them work the way I like. And for example, the Purescript plugin is for Emacs. I'd say probably it's the most feature rich out there. The VS Code one looks the nicest, and it's got because it's all good. It's all the LSP stuff in there, right? But the Emacs plugin actually directly talks to the PSCID server. There's no LSP thing in the middle.
In between, yeah.
So it can take advantage of some of the more advanced features of the protocol that I initially invented for PSCID because LSP didn't work back then. So
and also, so they also probably can easily things that don't fit into the LSP protocol very well, or maybe if it's probably like if you build a feature into the PSCID, right, then you're probably going to test it out in Emacs, right? So
yes,
it's going to probably get support first, right, and then
yes, exactly. So Emacs is just so very hackable, right? Everything is a Lisp function. Everything you do in your editor is a Lisp function that you can rip apart and change, or look at how it works and then change it. So yeah, that's a really cool thing about Emacs, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I kind of like, I started with the Emacs when I started with FP and then used it a lot, and now I'm using Vim, but I'm using a Vim that looks a lot like my old Emacs setup because I do window splits. I quit it very rarely. I have buffers that I manage with using plugins. I use like some Git plugin that's not quite Mac Git, but it's kind of
Right.
like it's sort of almost kind of like it. So yeah.
What's it called? The Fuge or something?
Fugitive, yeah.
Yeah, Fugitive. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's not quite the same thing, but
Oh yeah,
it's.
and I mean, and there's arc mode, which I use a lot. So,
Mhm.
um,
What are those missing features? Well, I mean, I guess it's also like because like I'm sure that if we start getting like asking Chris, hey, what are you using? And okay, you can do that in Vim, and you can do that in Vim, and you can do that in Vim, and it can probably get some part of the way there. But I think it's also about, hey, are you willing to spend like 3 days right now configuring Vim and getting used to it, right? And
Right.
if you're not having that pain, that you're not gonna do that, right? You're just gonna keep using Emacs.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it's also just the workflow thing, right? Vim is not when people write a plugin for Vim, they don't think about you running Vim for the entire day. They think about you running Vim to edit a file, then closing it to open it again on some other file, and then having Tmux to manage your different Vim things or something. But I don't want any of that. I just want one application that is my Emacs, and then I boot into that as the operating system, which is Emacs starts, and then I'm done with starting and closing programs because it's all Emacs from there.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of looking back into Emacs, and I might try it again because the biggest drive for me would be that I'm using NixOS now as my main development, my main personal development machine because I have to use macOS for work, but I still use Nix there as well, so it should still work. And then I really don't like the way Vim plugins are shared, right? And it's like it seemed like a lot more people use Emacs in Nix world than Vim, so I also don't want to do a lot of my own thing there and like create derivations for all the packages and update them manually or whatever. I kind of don't have time to do all of that, right? So I might actually that might be the reason to go back to Emacs for me, just being able to, because my Vim totally broke once, right? So I updated I did a plug update and then all the plugins updated, and one of them broke everything, and I have no idea which, and it took me a long time to figure that out. So if I can control that using Nix, then I'll be more comfortable with like reverting, rolling back, and like keeping strict versions of on plugins.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually a coworker. Like John Weekly is a coworker of mine, and he keeps trying to convince me to configure all my Emacs stuff with Nix. He's doing that for sure. So, and if John Weekly does it, then it must be a good way of using Emacs.
Yeah. Whenever I have 5 days when I'm not sure what to do with them, I'll probably start doing that.
Yeah, I've been saying that for 3 years. Yeah.
So let's see. Oh, okay. Sorry. So I misunderstood the question. So somebody, Andy S8, was asking what are the missing features that from PSEID that are available in Emacs but not in VS Code.
Yeah, so one of those is, for example, is that you have it's around auto completion. So the way the project the protocol works in the way it's written is that you request an autocomplete for an identifier, and then you pass along a bunch of filters that filter down the set of identifiers in the whole project to just and then you filter by prefixes, and you filter by your imported modules or something. And if you put together all those filters, you get a couple of results back, and you display those in the autocomplete window. And then there's also the like you can add imports by not via autocompletion, but by saying add an import at this point in time, or like at this location or something like that, and it looks at the identifier and tries to figure out where that is coming from. But sometimes it's ambiguous because, well, we don't parse the full file to do that, because again, then it wouldn't work if your file wasn't syntactically valid, which is not acceptable in my eyes. So because I need the ID the most when the file isn't working to get it back working. So that's the state I'm in 80% of the time. And so but the protocol then goes back and forth to let you selectively filter it down. So like tells you these are all the matches that are possible. I can't pick one. Tell me which one you have. But that's just not a thing the LSP does. So it doesn't have this like response request kind of situation there. You need to build that yourself. You can build it, but then you end up having to maintain state on the client and the server, and you end up having to write this like extension method, which means that now you don't work in all of the editors anymore. Like you need to write the extension, the client side implementation for that in all of the editors, basically.
Okay, cool.
So that's one of them. There's a few more like little things, but
okay, cool. So I guess that means that you don't have a way to make sure that your plugins, when you update the plugins, they won't break, right now. Or how do you, like, what's your plugin update process? Because I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so the main thing there, so the plugin update process is usually if I want to add a new API, I usually keep the old one around and add a deprecation warning. And it's going to continue working for the next 3 versions of Purescript or something. I just try to keep backwards compatibility for a long time. And then at some point, people just update their stuff, and then I can kill the old APIs. But with the slow release, like we're releasing a breaking change every year or so now. And so usually you get like, if I keep a feature around for deprecated for one like breaking change, and then remove it in the next one, that usually means that you have like a 2-year overlap, which is usually enough for people to upgrade their compiler.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So okay, let's get into the like looking in the future kind of things, right? So one thing that I'm curious and like I always wanted to hear about is, so what do you think? Where do you think this whole FP train is heading? Right? Do you think like, because on one hand we're seeing a lot of FP features from Haskell or Purescript, or like even like the and I'm specifically talking about the hardcore FPers, like the hardcore FP purely functional programming languages, right? And we're seeing a lot of languages getting features from the FP world, right? We're getting like some 10 years ago it was lambdas, and now it's like maybe some immutable data structures, ADTs, pattern matching in some languages. And
now
we're seeing like both C#, Java, and a lot of languages kind of like trying to fight into getting all of these features, right? And forcing them somehow on top of their crazy OP world, right? So so what do you think the future is, right? Because on one hand you could think like, hey, look, all of these languages will keep adopting FP features until the gap will be way smaller, and then maybe people don't need to go to Haskell because they already have like a strong FP like most languages will have a lot of FP features that you could just use when you want to. Do you think that just means that people will have an easier time learning FP, and then they'll just jump the gap, like more people will jump the gap? What do you think the future looks like?
Well, so I don't know how much my view counts here, but I think so. I don't think purely functional programming will become mainstream anytime soon, ever. I think what we need to do is we need to continue, or like we need to keep making it more and more viable as an option, and then more people will find their way into it and start using it. But I think the reason why Purescript has kind of actually had a reasonable uptake in the professional, like there's actually lots of companies using it. There's actually lots of very big companies that are not telling you about it using it, and or like there's a few of them anyway. And the reason why that works is that Purescript makes it very easy to say, this is my app. Oh, so this is my full app, and I'm going to write 20% of it in Purescript, and I'm going to bridge and I'm going to say, this is the FP, this is the FFI barrier. And I can move that slider back and forth depending on what my needs are.
And this is probably a lot to do to the fact that Purescript doesn't have a runtime, like a huge runtime, like JCJS has, right? Because with JCJS, it's very, very hard to like mix and match different, like this is Purescript and this is pure JavaScript and this is...
will take over your entire application.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the reason why that works really is because, well, Purescript works on top of JavaScript, which is already a very high level VM, trivial to link things together dynamically at runtime, essentially. Because, well, you don't actually need to link dynamically because bundlers do it statically, but kind of dynamic still. But yeah, and I think if we want to, I think WebAssembly is actually a huge opportunity there in the sense that it's a VM. It's a much lower level VM, but they are planning on giving us. There's the reference type proposal and there's the GC proposal, which would give us ways of sharing data and
making a reasonable target, right, for Purescript.
Yeah, well, I don't even know if Purescript is really if it's a reasonable target for Purescript. It's an opportunity to have functional programming languages interoperate with non-functional languages without having to, well, have two garbage collectors or three garbage collectors in the same program. Instead, if we were to be able to use some of the shared functionality that the WASM spec gives us, we could actually get like lightweight interoperability, which would let us do the same thing with Haskell, for example, the Asterios Haskell compiler there is, right? If that would end up not porting Haskell's GC to WASM, but instead use the GC that WASM is going to get at some point, which is, I mean, it's going to expose the JavaScript VM GC essentially, which is a very highly optimized garbage collector. So that's a very good one. And that would actually let you do the thing that Haskell makes incredibly hard. So it's very hard to have a Haskell program that communicates with a C program or like any other language, really, because, well, at the C barrier, you constantly have to marshal everything, and you have to be very careful about which objects are managed by Haskell's garbage collector and which memory is pinned and all that. So that's just not ergonomic, right? That's not a thing you do unless you absolutely have to. And so, yeah, I don't think there's a future in which we say we just keep on being this purely functional program is the only way of writing programs, and you should take your programming and write it in 100% Haskell, because that's just going to happen. What instead we should look is find the domains that we excel at, which there are a few. There's quite a few of those, and then make it very easy to use our functional languages for exactly those domains.
Yeah, that's also similar. Like, have you watched Gabriel Gonzalez's talk recently about like marketing Haskell?
I've seen him talk about that a few times, but I don't know if I've seen the most recent iteration.
Okay, because I think it was at the Zurich Hack, maybe, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Haskell Love, one of those, like a relatively recent. And yeah, he was kind of saying, okay, let's market Haskell to like interpreters, because that's what I think is the best. Like Haskell is probably best in class there, right? Or could become, at least, if we like do a bit more documentation, figure out which libraries we should recommend, and so on, for parsing. I
mean, parsing is the absolute fantastic best thing about Haskell.
Oh yeah, for sure. But then even there, like, consider a newbie like who doesn't know Haskell, like, oh, how do I choose between megaparsec, autoparsec, and all of those, right? And then there's no clear way to, okay, this is how you do it, right? There's no book of, hey, here's how you write an interpreter in Haskell, right? You kind of need to figure out stuff on your own. And if you've been using the language for a while, you definitely have your own opinions, and you can do that easily, right? But if you're not, then it's not that easy.
Yes, that's right. Well, the answer there is clearly just use megaparsec. But,
oh yeah, for sure. But okay, but where do you write that article, right? Do you write something on Haskell.org? That's not really politically correct to the other library authors, right? So it's kind of it's a bit tricky, right? So maybe somebody needs to write a good book on writing interpreters, and then they're free to pick something, right? And just use it. But
yeah, I feel like that's one of the things that we somehow need to make, or like, so the way I think about Purescript, if you want to learn Purescript these days, the best way to learn Purescript is to step one, join the Slack,
Oh yeah.
and then start working through the material and whatnot. And if you have a question, you just ask.
Oh yeah.
And there's a bunch of people that, including me, that are very willing to help you understand the question you asked.
Yeah, because we've seen a few people try to learn the book on their own and they get frustrated, right? Because it's like there are a lot of things like that are either implied or not explained very well, or maybe they're explained like some other person might get something, but another person might get stuck on something else because of their experience or whatever. So like Slack is such a good place to like just get unstuck initially without getting frustrated and annoyed or whatever, right?
Yes. I mean, it's also just it's super hard. I'm going to say it's impossible to write a book that is going to work for every reader. They're just going to have so different backgrounds every time.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
If you want to write a book that doesn't assume anything, it's going to be 2,000 pages.
It's going to be the Haskell book, right?
It's going to be the Haskell book, right? Which is
like 1,600 pages and even...
Yeah. And that's going to throw off as many, like, that's the lowest common denominator, right? That's not a good book. That's a book which is not good. Like, it's not the perfect book for anyone. It's just a workable book for everyone.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely. And even there, like you see people come on Haskell beginners and get stuck on like that book, which tries to like go very slowly and explain everything and do tons of exercises and so on. And people still get stuck there because that's the reality, right? There's no way you can write something where nobody gets stuck, right?
Right. I mean, the other part of that is that I don't have a 1,600 page attention span, so I'm gonna I'm gonna forget a bunch of the stuff I read in the beginning if I'm not applying it regularly.
Oh yeah, and I think that also scares a lot of people away from a language, right? Because okay, here's Python, you need to do this like 24-hour tutorial, right? And then even if you're not very familiar with programming, it will work to get you at least somewhat like be able to hack some scripts together, right?
That worked for me.
Yeah,
I learned
exactly.
all my algorithms and data structures in Python because it was a fantastic language for that, because usually these algorithms are 300 lines or something, and that's exactly the kind of attention span that I have in Python.
Yeah, exactly. But then you say, okay, but if you want to learn Haskell, you need to read this 1,600 tome thing, right? I'm going to be, okay, I'm not going to do that because I can learn like 20 languages in that period. And they'd be right? Because like people don't really see before they buy, right? So it's kind of like you have to like pay a lot and then you will see the advantages way later. It's kind of like, that seems like a big investment.
Yeah, so that's why we need to be in the peripheral vision when someone runs into the problem of, I need to parse a complicated piece of text, or I need to do this thing which is kind of like an interpreter for something, or I need to, like, I don't know, parse and write the streaming data, and we need to make sure that Haskell appears somewhere in that space.
Yeah, on the other hand, it's really hard, right? Because Haskell's not the language where you can, like, because I think the culture right now with most programmers is that you can copy paste like a few lines from Stack Overflow and then play with them, and then you can like get something working. Whereas with like Haskell or even Purescript, that's super hard to do, because if you don't really understand the language, you can easily run into errors that you have no idea how to fix.
Well, my experience is you can get something that seems to be working for a while from copying a bunch of stuff together until you realize it doesn't work and you have no way of figuring out.
No, sure, I definitely agree, right? That's not a good way to write programs, but it seems to work, right? And some people
But I still think there's a bunch of people that have been burnt by this, and they know that just copy pasting a bunch of code together and then they get into the problem of, I don't know. I've had a coworker, for example, who was like super confident in his Node.js skills, and then he hacked together a bunch of promise code, and now he needed to start synchronizing things, and it all fell apart. And he didn't know where anything was anymore, and he just had 50 console.log statements and tried to understand how things were ordered based on these. And all of that would have gone away had he worked with a proper concurrency model.
Yeah, I mean, even within the same language, like Node.js, you could but you need to like understand what you're building very well before you do that. A lot better if you do than if you do it with Haskell, right? Because if you do it to the different, like the strongly typed language, it will guide you a bit, right?
Yes, I mean, if you had F, like F, Purescript's F.
Yeah.
he would have been perfectly fine. I mean, he probably wouldn't have been able to write his program for a while, but
Yeah.
once he figured out he was off, he would have probably been fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe the main target for this sort of languages should be people that are frustrated by the current state of affairs, right? And like, okay, I think I'm a good programmer, but I keep writing bugs. How can I write fewer bugs, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think people that make that realization, there's enough reflection going on there on themselves that they are probably also good learners. So they probably also have the best chance of actually succeeding in.
Yeah, but I guess then the trick is not to throw that 1600 tome at them, because even if they're frustrated, they might not buy into
They have a very specific problem,
Yeah.
and you should have a nice resource that tackles exactly that problem.
Yeah,
that problem.
one thing that I really like is like the Jordan Martinez's new cookbook repository, because that's something that you can like, hey, I want to see how this would like how do I do this in Purescript, and even if it's maybe you download it, you try it, and you try changing it, and you can't figure out how to change it, but at least it works. That's it. Like you can git reset, and then it works, and then at least you see, okay, this is how like get a feel for the language, for libraries, for how to solve some problems at least.
I mean, and if you want to go full circle, I had the problem that I wanted to write a parser for a calculator like thing, or like some. I wanted to write a parser, and then there was this YouTube series of someone doing it in Haskell, and they weren't trying to teach me Haskell, but they used basic Haskell, and they were solving a problem I was interested in, and so I followed along and figured out what I needed to do to write a parser for Haskell. Cool. And they weren't trying to teach me the language. They were trying to show me how to
solve that specific problem.
Okay. Yes, exactly.
Cool. Yeah, that's interesting. And they're probably also teaching Haskell, but not explicitly, not directly. It's like, okay, we need this because we're trying to solve this problem, not because not because I want you to know what a category is, right? I'm not going to go into that because, don't do that. If people want to learn about that, they'll just,
I mean, they were pointing things out like this type signature looks a little weird. Why is there 3 arrows here? But it's really, these are all individual arguments, and this is the result one. And the reason it looks this way is currying, and we're going to see how that works in a bit. And then when it came up, they showed how it worked. But it wasn't like, now we're going to learn currying.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. I don't know, and we're going to take a detour into Lambda Calculus. And yeah.